The key scraped in the lock, a sound that should have been comforting after a long business trip. Instead, it sent a chill down my spine. Something was off. I pushed open the door, my rolling suitcase forgotten behind me. The entryway was different. Gone were my carefully curated family photos, replaced by gaudy floral prints I'd never choose in a million years. "Mark?" I called out, my voice echoing in the strangely quiet house. "Are you home?" A familiar figure emerged from the kitchen, but it wasn't my husband. It was Linda, my mother-in-law, wearing an apron and holding a wooden spoon like she owned the place. "Hannah, dear, you're back early," she chirped, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I blinked, trying to process the scene before me. "Linda, what are you doing here? Where's Mark?" She waved the spoon dismissively. "Oh, Mark's working late. I thought I'd come over and spruce things up a bit. This place needed a woman's touch." My jaw clenched. "A woman's touch? Linda, I live here. This is my home." Linda's eyes narrowed slightly. "Well, it's Mark's home too, isn't it? And as his mother, I have every right to help out." I took a deep breath, counting to 10 in my head. "Where are my things? The photos, the artwork?" "Oh, those old things," Linda interrupted. "I put them away for safekeeping. You'll thank me later, dear. Now come have some tea. I've made your favorite cookies." I stood rooted to the spot, my mind reeling. This wasn't the first time Linda had overstepped, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. Just then the front door opened, and Mark walked in. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. "Hannah, you're home early," he said, glancing nervously between his mother and me. I turned to him, my voice low and controlled. "Mark, what's going on here?" He ran a hand through his hair, a telltale sign of his discomfort. "Mom just wanted to help out while you were away. She thought it would be a nice surprise." "A surprise?" I echoed, my voice rising. "Mark, she's completely changed our home without my permission." Linda stepped forward, placing a hand on Mark's arm. "Now, Hannah, there's no need to get upset. I was only trying to help." I whirled on her. "Help? You call this helping? You've invaded our privacy, rearranged our home, and hidden my personal belongings." Mark held up his hands placatingly. "Let's all calm down, Mom. Maybe you should head home. Hannah and I need to talk." Linda's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Of course, dear. I'll just grab my things." As she disappeared upstairs, I turned to Mark, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. "How could you let this happen?" He sighed, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't think it would be such a big deal. Mom just wanted to do something nice for us." I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. "Nice? Mark, this isn't nice. This is a complete violation of our home, our privacy. Don't you see that?" Before he could respond, Linda reappeared, purse in hand. She paused at the door, her voice sickly sweet. "I'll be back tomorrow to finish up, dear. There's still so much to do." As the door closed behind her, I felt something inside me snap. I turned to Mark, my voice low and dangerous. "If you don't fix this, and I mean right now, we're going to have a much bigger problem than your mother redecorating our house." Mark's face paled, and I knew this was far from over. The battle lines had been drawn, and I was ready for war. I stood in our bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of Linda's redecorating. The floral wallpaper made my head spin, and I fought the urge to tear it down with my bare hands. Mark hovered in the doorway, his face a mixture of guilt and apprehension. "Hannah, I'm sorry. I'll talk to Mom, okay? We'll fix this," he said, his voice pleading. I turned to face him, my anger barely contained. "This isn't just about the house, Mark. It's about us. It's about your mother constantly overstepping and you letting her." His shoulders slumped. "She means well, Hannah. She's just trying to help." "Help?" I scoffed. "Let me remind you of our wedding day." The memory flooded back, as vivid as if it were yesterday. Linda, resplendent in white, upstaging me at my own wedding. Mark, too afraid to say anything, even as I fought back tears. "She wore white, Mark. White, to our wedding." Mark winced. I know, but she said it was cream, and I cut him off. And you believed her? Or did you just not want to rock the boat?" He fell silent, and I knew I'd hit the mark. It had always been like this, from the moment we said, "I do." A knock at the front door interrupted our standoff. Mark looked relieved at the distraction, but my stomach dropped. I knew that imperious rap of knuckles all too well. "Mark? Hannah? Are you home?" Linda's voice carried through the house. Before I could protest, Mark was already heading downstairs. I followed, my fists clenched at my sides. Linda breezed in, arms laden with shopping bags. I've brought some more things for the house. Oh, Hannah, dear, you look tired. Perhaps you should lie down while Mark and I finish up here. I felt my eye twitch. Linda, this needs to stop. Now. She blinked innocently. Stop what, dear? I'm only trying to help. Isn't that right, Mark? Mark looked between us, clearly torn. Mom, maybe we should talk about this, Hannah and I. Nonsense, Linda interrupted. There's nothing to talk about. Now, where shall we put these new curtains? I stepped forward, blocking her path. Linda, listen to me. This is our home, mine and Mark's, not yours. Linda's eyes narrowed. Well, I never. Mark, are you going to let her speak to me like this? I turned to my husband, silently pleading with him to stand up to his mother just this once. Mark swallowed hard. Mom, Hannah's right. We appreciate your help, but nothing, Linda snapped. I'm your mother, Mark. I know what's best for you, both of you. I felt something inside me snap. No, you don't. You have no idea what's best for us because you refuse to see us as adults. We're not children, Linda. We don't need your help, and we certainly don't need you redecorating our home without our permission. Linda gasped, clutching her pearls. Well, I never. Mark, are you going to let her speak to me like this? I held my breath, waiting for Mark's response. This was it, the moment of truth. Mark looked at his mother, then at me. I could see the conflict in his eyes. Finally, he spoke. Mom, I think you should go home now. Linda's jaw dropped. What? Please, Mom, just go home. We'll talk later. As Linda stormed out, slamming the door behind her, I felt a mix of relief and trepidation. I turned to Mark, searching his face. Thank you, I said softly. He nodded, looking exhausted. I'm sorry, Hannah. I should have stood up to her sooner. I wanted to believe this was a turning point, that things would be different now. But as I looked around at our transformed home, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a long, difficult battle. The weeks following our confrontation with Linda were blissfully quiet. Mark and I had almost managed to restore our home to its former state, erasing the last traces of Linda's improvements. I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, we'd turned a corner. I should have known better. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when the doorbell rang. Mark was out running errands, so I answered it, my heart sinking as I saw Linda's beaming face. Surprise! She chirped, pushing past me into the house. I thought I'd drop by for a little visit. I forced a smile. Linda, this isn't a good time. Mark's not even home. She waved her hand dismissively. Oh, that's all right. We can have some girl time. Before I could protest, she was in the kitchen, pulling pots and pans from the cupboards. I'll whip us up a nice lunch. You just relax, dear. I gritted my teeth. Linda, please, I appreciate the offer, but... Nonsense, she interrupted. It's no trouble at all. Now, where do you keep your good china? As she rummaged through my cabinets, I felt my patience wearing thin. Linda, stop. This is my home, and I didn't invite you over. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. I'm family, Hannah. I don't need an invitation. Yes, you do, I insisted. You can't just barge in here whenever you feel like it. Linda's face hardened. I'm only trying to help. You should be grateful. Grateful? I scoffed. For what? For invading my privacy? For disrespecting my boundaries? She gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. How dare you? After everything I've done for you and Mark. Everything you've done? I felt my voice rising. You mean like wearing white to our wedding? Or redecorating our house without permission? Linda's eyes flashed. I was trying to make things better. This house was a disaster before I stepped in. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Linda, I need you to listen to me. This behavior has to stop. You can't keep interfering in our lives like this. She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Interfering? I'm looking out for my son's best interests. Someone has to, since you clearly can't. That was the last straw. Get out, I said, my voice low and dangerous. Linda blinked, taken aback. Excuse me? I said, get out, now. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then, her face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little... The front door opened, and Mark walked in, freezing at the scene before him. What's going on? Linda immediately burst into tears. Oh, Mark, your wife is being so cruel to me. I only wanted to help, and she's throwing me out. Mark looked between us, confusion and distress evident on his face. Hannah, what? I cut him off. Your mother showed up uninvited and refused to leave when I asked her to. Linda sniffled dramatically. I just wanted to spend time with my family. Is that so wrong? Mark ran a hand through his hair, clearly torn. Mom, maybe now isn't the best time. Why don't I call you later? Linda's tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of triumph. Of course, dear, I'll go. But remember, I'm always here for you. As she swept out the door, I turned to Mark, my anger barely contained. This has to stop, Mark. We need to set some serious boundaries with your mother. He sighed heavily. I know. But she's my mom, Hannah. What am I supposed to do? I stared at him, disbelief and disappointment washing over me. You're supposed to support me, your wife. You're supposed to stand up to her when she oversteps. Mark looked away, unable to meet my eyes. In that moment, I realized with a sinking heart that this battle was far from over. And worse, I might be fighting it alone. The tension in our house had become unbearable. Mark and I barely spoke, the silence between us filled with unspoken accusations and resentment. I knew something had to give, and soon. It was a crisp autumn morning when I made my decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I had to confront Linda once and for all. I drove to her house, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw George, my father-in-law, leaving for work. He gave me a sad, knowing look as he passed by. It struck me then how rarely I saw him smile these days. Linda answered the door in her silk robe, surprise flickering across her face. Hannah? What are you doing here so early? I stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk, Linda, now. She followed me into the living room, her eyes narrowing. If this is about the other day, I think you owe me an apology. I whirled around to face her. An apology? You're the one who needs to apologize, Linda, for years of manipulation, for constantly undermining my marriage, for treating me like I'm not good enough for your precious son. Linda's face hardened. How dare you come into my home and speak to me like this? I've only ever wanted what's best for Mark. No, I shot back. You've only ever wanted what's best for you. You can't stand the idea of Mark having a life that doesn't revolve around you. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. That's ridiculous. Everything I do is for my family. I laughed bitterly. Family? Is that what you call it when you show up uninvited, rearrange our home, and constantly criticize everything I do? Linda's eyes flashed dangerously. I'm his mother. I have every right. No, you don't, I interrupted. You have no right to interfere in our marriage. No right to make me feel like an outsider in my own home. She stepped closer, her voice low and menacing. Listen here, you ungrateful little brat. Mark was fine before you came along. He doesn't need you. He has me. Something inside me snapped. That's exactly the problem, Linda. He's a grown man, not a little boy. He doesn't need you controlling his life. Linda's face contorted with rage. You think you can come between us? I raised him. I know what he needs better than anyone. What he needs is a mother who respects his choices and his marriage, I retorted, not someone who treats him like a possession. She raised her hand, and for a moment I thought she might actually strike me. Instead, she pointed at the door. Get out of my house, now. I stood my ground. Not until you understand that this has to stop. The constant interference, the manipulation, all of it. Linda's laugh was cold and cruel. Or what? You'll leave him? Go ahead. He'll always choose me over you. Her words hit me like a physical blow, because deep down I feared she might be right. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This isn't over, Linda. I won't let you destroy my marriage. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of a framed photo on the mantel. It was Mark as a child, smiling brightly, with Linda's arms wrapped possessively around him. The image made my stomach churn. I walked out of Linda's house, my mind reeling. I knew I had just thrown down the gauntlet, and there was no going back now. The war was on, and I had to be prepared for whatever Linda might do next. As I drove home, a sense of resolve settled over me. I would fight for my marriage, for my home, for the life Mark and I had built together. And if Linda thought I would back down easily, she was in for a rude awakening, because this time I was ready to play her game and win. I paced our living room, rehearsing the conversation I needed to have with Mark. My confrontation with Linda had left me raw and determined. It was time for Mark to choose, his mother or our marriage. When he walked through the door, I steeled myself. Mark, we need to talk. He sighed, dropping his briefcase. Hannah, can't this wait? I've had a long day. No, I said firmly. It can't. This is about us, about our future. Mark's shoulders slumped as he sat on the couch. What's wrong now? I took a deep breath. I went to see your mother today. His head snapped up. You did what? I had to, Mark. Things couldn't go on like this. I told her she needs to stop interfering in our lives. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his face a mix of frustration and anxiety. Hannah, you shouldn't have done that. You know how Mom gets. That's exactly the problem, I exclaimed. You always defend her no matter what she does. When are you going to stand up for me, for us? He stood up, pacing the room. What do you want me to do? She's my mother. And I'm your wife. I shot back. Your mother told me you don't need me, that you'll always choose her over me. Is she right, Mark? The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's hesitation felt like a knife to my heart. I can't believe this, I whispered. After everything we've been through, you still can't choose me over her? Mark reached for me, but I stepped back. Hannah, it's not that simple. I love you, but she's family. I'm your family too, Mark. Or at least I thought I was. Just then, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. It's Mom. She says she's coming over. Panic rose in my chest. No, absolutely not. I can't deal with her right now. Mark looked torn. She's upset, Hannah. I can't just turn her away. I felt something inside me break. If she comes here, I'm leaving. I mean it, Mark. He stared at me, disbelief etched on his face. You can't be serious. I am, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. I won't be disrespected in my own home anymore. It's time for you to make a choice. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Mark looked from me to the door, indecision written all over his face. Mark, I pleaded one last time. Please. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then moved towards the door. My heart sank as I watched him reach for the handle. In that moment, I made my decision. I rushed upstairs, threw some clothes into a suitcase, and grabbed my laptop. As I came back down, I could hear Linda's voice, shrill and angry, filling the house. Mark's eyes widened when he saw my suitcase. Hannah, wait. But I was already heading for the door. I have a business trip next week. I'm leaving early. Don't try to contact me. Linda appeared in the hallway, her face triumphant. Running away, are we? I told you, Mark, she doesn't have what it takes. I paused at the door, turning to face them both. No, Linda, I'm not running away. I'm giving your son a chance to figure out what he really wants. And Mark, I said, meeting his eyes, when I get back, you better have made your choice, because I won't live like this anymore. With that, I walked out, leaving a stunned silence behind me. As I drove away, tears streaming down my face, I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life or the first step towards saving myself. Either way, I knew things would never be the same again. The taxi pulled up to our house, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. After a week away, I was both eager and terrified to see what awaited me. Mark hadn't called once during my trip, and I didn't know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. As I approached the front door, I noticed something off. The curtains were different, heavy floral patterns that I would never choose. My key stuck in the lock, and when I finally got the door open, I froze in shock. Our home had been completely transformed. Gone were our modern furnishings, replaced by stuffy antiques and gaudy decorations. The walls, once a soothing gray, were now covered in busy wallpaper. Mark? I called out, my voice echoing in the unfamiliar space. In here, dear? Linda's voice answered from the kitchen. I stormed in, fury building with each step. Linda stood at the counter, wearing an apron and looking perfectly at home. What have you done? I demanded. She smiled, a picture of innocence. Oh, Hannah, welcome home. Do you like the changes? I thought it was time this place had a woman's touch. A woman's touch? I sputtered. This is my home, Linda. Where's Mark? He's at work, of course, she replied, waving a hand dismissively. Now, why don't you go freshen up while I finish dinner? I stared at her, disbelief warring with rage. You need to leave. Now. Linda's eyes narrowed. I don't think so, dear. You see, while you were gone, Mark and I had a long talk. He agrees that I should move in to help out. Move in? I felt like I was in a nightmare. That's impossible. Mark would never agree to that. She smirked, pulling an envelope from her pocket. Oh, but he did. In fact, he signed over half the house to me, for safekeeping, you understand. I snatched the paper from her hand, my eyes scanning the legal document. There it was, in black and white. Mark had given Linda partial ownership of our home. "This can't be legal," I whispered. "Oh, it's perfectly legal," Linda gloated, "and there's nothing you can do about it." In that moment, something inside me snapped. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mark's number. "Hannah?" he answered, sounding surprised. "Get home, now," I growled, hanging up before he could respond. I turned back to Linda, who was watching me with a smug expression. "This isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," she replied. "Face it, Hannah, you've lost. Mark will always choose me." I was about to retort when the front door opened. Mark walked in, his face pale as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, looking between Linda and me. "Your mother says you signed over half our house to her," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Please tell me that's not true." Mark's silence was all the confirmation I needed. "How could you?" I whispered, feeling tears prick my eyes. "Hannah, I can explain," he started, but I cut him off. "Explain what? That you betrayed me? That you let your mother take over our home?" Linda stepped forward, placing a hand on Mark's arm. "Now, dear, don't be dramatic. We're all family here." I laughed bitterly. "Family? Is that what you call this?" Mark looked torn, his gaze shifting between his mother and me. I thought this would make things easier." "Easier?" I echoed in disbelief. "How is this easier?" Linda smiled triumphantly. "See, Mark? I told you she wouldn't understand. She's never appreciated everything we do for her." Something inside me hardened. I looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw a man I no longer recognized. "I want a divorce," I said quietly. The room fell silent. Mark's face drained of color, while Linda's eyes gleamed with victory. "Hannah, please," Mark began, but I held up a hand. "No, I'm done. I won't live like this anymore." I turned to Linda. "You wanted him? You can have him, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As I walked out of the house that was no longer my home, I felt a strange mix of despair and determination. I had lost everything, but in that loss, I found a resolve I never knew I had. This was war, and I was ready to fight. I sat in Layla's office, my hands shaking as I clutched a manila folder. My friend and lawyer looked at me with a mix of concern and determination. "Are you sure about this, Hannah?" Layla asked, her voice gentle but firm. I nodded, my jaw set. "I'm sure. It's time to end this once and for all." Layla picked up her phone. "I'll set up the meeting. Are you ready to face them?" "I have to be," I replied, steeling myself for what was to come. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Mark, Linda, and George in a conference room. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Linda glared at me, her eyes cold. "What's the meaning of this, Hannah? Haven't you caused enough trouble?" I ignored her, turning to Layla. She nodded, then addressed the room. "We're here today because my client, Hannah, has evidence of fraudulent activity regarding the transfer of property." Mark's head snapped up. "What?" "That's impossible. I signed those papers myself." "Under duress," I interjected, my voice steady, "and with false information." Linda scoffed. "This is ridiculous. George, tell them how absurd this is." But George remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on. Layla continued, "We have reason to believe that Linda misrepresented her financial situation to influence Mark's decision. Furthermore, we have evidence of other improprieties." Linda's face paled. "What are you talking about?" I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "I know about the affair, Linda." The room fell silent. Mark looked bewildered, while George's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. "What affair?" Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I pulled out a stack of photos from the manila folder, spreading them across the table. They showed Linda with a man who was definitely not George, in various compromising positions. George's face crumpled as he looked at the photos. "Linda, how could you?" Linda's composure cracked. "It's not what it looks like. George, please." But George was already standing, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I can't believe this. All these years." Mark stared at the photos, then at his mother. "Mom, is this true?" Linda's eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. "Mark." "Sweetie, you don't understand. Your father, he—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," George interrupted, his voice trembling with anger. "I've put up with your manipulation for years, but this is the last straw." I watched as the family I had once been a part of imploded before my eyes. Part of me felt vindicated, but another part ached for the pain I saw on their faces. Mark turned to me, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Hannah, why didn't you tell me?" Would you have believed me? I asked softly. You never took my side before. He flinched as if I'd slapped him. I'm so sorry. I had no idea. Linda suddenly stood up, her chair toppling over. This is all your fault. She screamed at me. You've ruined everything. She lunged across the table, her hands outstretched as if to strangle me. I recoiled, but before she could reach me, George grabbed her arm. That's enough, Linda, he said, his voice cold. It's over. As security escorted a hysterical Linda from the room, I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. Relief, sadness, anger, and a glimmer of hope. Mark reached out, his hand hovering over mine. Hannah, I don't know what to say. I pulled my hand away, my heart heavy. There's nothing to say, Mark. It's too late. As I walked out of the conference room, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where I would finally put myself first. 6 months after the explosive revelation, I stood on the steps of the courthouse, my heart pounding. Today was the final hearing for both divorces, mine from Mark and George's from Linda. The air was thick with tension as we all filed into the courtroom. As the judge entered, I caught sight of Linda. She looked smaller somehow, her once immaculate appearance now disheveled. Mark sat beside her, his eyes darting nervously between his mother and me. George sat alone, his face a mask of quiet determination. The proceedings began, and I listened as Layla presented our case. She detailed Linda's manipulation, the fraudulent property transfer, and the affair. With each word, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she launched into a tirade. This is all a misunderstanding. I only wanted what was best for my family. Hannah never understood our bond. She tried to come between us. The judge silenced her with a stern look. Mrs. Thompson, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Your actions were not only manipulative, but illegal. I watched as the color drained from Linda's face. For the first time, I saw her for what she truly was, a scared, insecure woman who had spent her life controlling others to feel powerful. The judge continued, in light of the evidence, I'm ruling in favor of Mrs. Hannah Thompson. The property transfer is nullified, and Mrs. Linda Thompson will be required to pay damages for her fraudulent actions. A collective gasp filled the room. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by a deep sadness for the family that had been torn apart. As we filed out of the courtroom, Mark approached me. Hannah, I'm so sorry for everything. I should have stood up to my mother. I should have believed in us. I looked at him, seeing the regret in his eyes. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to go back to the way things were, but I knew that wasn't possible. I'm sorry too, Mark, I said softly, but we can't go back. It's time for both of us to move forward. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. As he walked away, I felt a chapter of my life closing. George approached next, looking years older than when I'd first met him. Hannah, I want to thank you. If it weren't for you, I might never have known the truth. I've wasted so many years, but now I have a chance to live the life I want. I squeezed his hand, feeling a kinship with this man who had also been a victim of Linda's manipulation. You deserve happiness, George. I hope you find it. As I turned to leave, I saw Linda standing alone, her face a mixture of anger and despair. For a moment, our eyes met. I expected to feel triumph or anger, but instead, I felt pity. Linda had lost everything, her husband, her son's trust, her power. In the end, her manipulations had cost her everything she held dear. I walked out of the courthouse feeling the warm sun on my face. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. The house was mine again, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my life. As I drove home, I realized that this experience had changed me. I was stronger now, more confident in my own worth. I had faced my greatest fear, losing everything, and come out the other side. Pulling into my driveway, I smiled at the sight of my home. It was time to redecorate, to erase the last traces of Linda's influence. But more than that, it was time to start a new chapter. I may have lost the family I married into, but I had gained something far more valuable: self-respect, strength, and the knowledge that I could weather any storm. As I unlocked the door, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see what it held. I had survived the storm, and now it was time to enjoy the calm that followed. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing that I had the strength to face it head-on. This wasn't just an ending. It was a new beginning.